The day Edna Rhodes decided she was done being invisible was the same day a dusty stranger rode into Colton Creek with nothing but a bay horse, a worn leather saddlebag, and eyes the color of storm-washed sky. Colton Creek sat in the heart of Texas, wedged between two ridgelines that turned copper at sunset, and in the year 1878 it was exactly the kind of place where people came to disappear or to start over, and sometimes those two things were one and the same. The town had a main street with a saloon, a general store, a livery, a small church painted white that was peeling in the heat, and a post office that doubled as the sheriff's office on account of Sheriff Harlan Pruitt being too lazy to maintain two separate buildings. There were maybe 200 souls scattered across the surrounding ranches and the cluster of homes that made up the town proper, and most of those souls knew each other's business before anyone had a chance to keep it private. Edna Rhodes was 24 years old, and she had been working in the Colton Creek boarding house since she was 16, when her mother passed from fever and left her with nothing but a half-empty trunk of clothes and a piece of advice that hadn't served her well since. Keep your head down and your mouth shut, and maybe the world will leave you be. The world had not left Edna be, not entirely. It had pressed up against her in ways that left bruises she couldn't always explain, and it had made her small in ways that had nothing to do with her height, which was actually quite considerable for a woman. She was tall and lean with dark brown hair she kept pinned up under a cloth cap while she worked, and she had green eyes that were striking enough that people occasionally mentioned them in a way that made her feel noticed without feeling seen. She worked for a woman named Mrs. Hortense Briggs, who owned the boarding house and operated it with a combination of iron efficiency and cheerful cruelty that kept her boarders compliant and her staff exhausted. Edna washed linens and cooked breakfast and swept floors and hauled water and mended curtains and did all the things that kept a 10-room boarding house functional, and she was paid a small wage that barely covered the cramped room she rented in the back of the very building she worked in. She ate what was left after the boarders had eaten. She slept when the work was done. She had no particular social life to speak of, because Mrs. Briggs disapproved of her staff entertaining company during hours that could otherwise be spent on useful labor, and Mrs. Briggs had a talent for making those hours span from before dawn until after dark. Edna had one friend, a woman named Pearl Hawkins, who ran the seamstress shop on the corner of Main and Church Street, and Pearl was the kind of woman who compensated for a difficult life by being relentlessly cheerful about everything, which Edna found both exhausting and deeply comforting in equal measure. Pearl had red hair and a gap between her front teeth, and she laughed too loud and too often, and Edna loved her for it because it filled up spaces that would otherwise be very quiet. It was Pearl who pointed out the stranger first. Edna had been crossing the main street with a basket of linens she was taking to be aired, walking quickly because Mrs. Briggs had timed her on such errands before and considered anything over 8 minutes to be dawdling, when Pearl appeared in the doorway of the seamstress shop and grabbed her sleeve. "Edna, look." Edna looked. She saw the man riding down the main street on the bay horse, moving at an unhurried walk that suggested he was not concerned about dawdling or time or Mrs. Briggs or anything else the world might try to impose on him. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a plain brown coat over a blue shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable use. He had a lean jaw covered in a few days of stubble, and he was looking at the town with the careful, measuring attention of someone who had learned to read places the way some people read books. "So," Edna said. "So he's handsome," Pearl said. "There are handsome men in Colton Creek," Edna said, though she was still watching him. "There are men in Colton Creek," Pearl said. "This is different." Edna did not entirely disagree, though she would not have said so out loud because agreeing with Pearl on matters of this sort tended to generate conversations that lasted considerably longer than 8 minutes. She shifted the basket against her hip and kept walking, but she did watch from the corner of her eye as the stranger tied his horse in front of the general store and went inside. That evening at supper, she heard from two of the boarding house's regular tenants, a pair of traveling merchants named Gideon Ash and Walter Fenn, that the stranger was a man named Clyde Bailey, that he had come from up around Abilene, that he had been a cattle driver for a number of years, and that he was reportedly looking to settle somewhere quiet. This information was delivered with the casual authority of men who had spent 20 minutes talking to someone they had never met before, which was the way most information traveled in Colton Creek. Edna listened without appearing to listen, which was a skill she had developed over years of working in spaces where her presence was considered irrelevant to whatever conversation was happening around her. She carried plates and refilled water glasses and did not ask any questions, because questions would have earned her a look from Mrs. Briggs that she did not care to receive before bedtime. She did not expect to encounter Clyde Bailey again with any particular consequence. She had encountered plenty of men passing through Colton Creek, and most of them had passed through without generating anything beyond a brief period of local gossip. She had no reason to believe this one would be different. She was wrong about that, but she did not find out she was wrong for another 2 days. The general store in Colton Creek was owned by a man named Augustus Webb, who was fair in his dealings and kept his shelves reasonably stocked and extended a certain amount of credit to ranchers he trusted, which made him one of the more respected men in the county. Edna went to the general store twice a week for the boarding house supplies, because Mrs. Briggs trusted no one else with the task after a prior hired girl had allegedly shorted the account on flour and vinegar, which Mrs. Briggs had never forgiven and never forgotten and brought up with some frequency. On the Thursday morning that changed the particular shape of Edna's life, she was standing at the counter waiting for Augustus Webb to locate a specific kind of soap that Mrs. Briggs had ordered, and Clyde Bailey came in through the front door with a list in his hand, and the unhurried manner she had noticed from a distance 2 days prior. Up close, she found that her initial assessment had been accurate in terms of the general outline, but insufficient in terms of detail. He was somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29, with the kind of weathered quality that came not from age but from years spent outdoors in sun and wind and weather. His eyes were, in fact, the color of storm-washed sky, a particular shade of gray-blue that she had not seen before in anyone's face, and that she noticed more than she intended to. He was not flashy or loud or performing himself in the way that some men in western towns did, as though their entire presence was a kind of advertisement. He seemed simply like a man who knew where he was and what he was doing there. He stood beside her at the counter, waiting his turn, and said nothing for a moment, and then said without looking at her, "I heard they have good soap here." Edna looked at him. That is a very specific thing to have heard about a general store. The corner of his mouth moved. "I heard other things too. The soap seemed like a good starting point." "What else did you hear?" He turned to look at her then, and there was something in the directness of it that was unusual enough to hold her attention. Most men who spoke to her did so at an angle, as though she was a thing adjacent to what they were actually looking at. "I heard this is a town where a man could find land worth settling on if he looked right." "That depends on what you mean by worth settling on," Edna said. "I mean land that's yours when you work it," he said. "Not someone else's that you manage for wages. Land where you can put up a building and know it's not going to be taken from underneath you." Augustus Webb returned with the soap and set it on the counter, and the conversation was interrupted by the business of the transaction. But when Edna had paid and was gathering her supplies, Clyde Bailey said, "I'm Clyde Bailey. I apologize for not saying so at the start." "Edna Rhodes," she said, "and you don't need to apologize for it." "Good manners cost nothing," he said. "My mother said that. She sounds sensible." She was. He said it simply, without any particular heaviness, but she caught the past tense and did not press it. "Do you live here in town, Miss Rhodes?" "I work at the boarding house," she said, and left it at that, because the distinction between living somewhere and working somewhere felt important to her in a way she could not always articulate but had never stopped feeling. He nodded as though he understood that distinction without her having to explain it. "I'm staying there myself," he said, "temporarily, until I sort out the land situation." "Then I'll see you at breakfast," she said, and picked up her basket and walked out of the store. She thought about the conversation for longer than was warranted for an exchange of perhaps 2 minutes with a stranger. She noticed herself thinking about it, which was itself unusual, because Edna's interior life was generally organized around the practical and the immediate, around what needed to be done next and what had been left undone, and not around strangers in general stores with storm-washed eyes and opinions about good manners. She was, she told herself, simply being observant. It was a useful quality in her line of work. At breakfast the following morning, she served 6 boarders their eggs and bread and coffee, and Clyde Bailey sat at the far end of the long table and ate without any fuss, and said good morning to her when she brought his coffee and thank you when she refilled it. And both of those things were so unremarkable in intention, and yet so remarkable in her actual experience that she caught Pearl's eye across the room. Because Pearl had come by on some errand and was watching from the doorway with an expression that communicated entirely too much satisfaction for a woman who had only been watching for 30 seconds. After breakfast was cleared and Mrs. Briggs had gone to conduct some business at the dry goods establishment down the street, Pearl materialized in the kitchen with the speed of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "He said thank you," Pearl said. "People do," Edna said, scrubbing a pan. "Not to you they don't, not like that." Edna scrubbed the pan. "You're reading too much into a polite word." "I'm reading exactly the right amount," Pearl said. "You should talk to him. I spoke to him yesterday at the general store." Pearl's eyes widened. "You did? What did you say?" "We discussed soap." Pearl stared at her. "Edna." "And land," Edna added. "He's looking to settle somewhere, buy land." Pearl was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Edna looked at her. Pearl was watching her with an expression that was softer than her usual grin. "That's a man with a plan," Pearl said. "Or a man with a notion," Edna said. "Plenty of men come through here with notions." "This one came in with a horse and a list for the general store," Pearl said. "That's more organized than a notion." Edna didn't answer, but she thought about it. Over the course of the following week, Clyde Bailey made himself a quiet and unremarkable presence at the boarding house in the way that distinguished genuinely steady people from those who merely performed steadiness. He was gone most days by mid-morning, riding out to look at parcels of land that various people had directed him toward, and he came back in the evening, ate supper, sometimes sat on the front porch for an hour before retiring. He did not drink heavily or gamble or raise his voice or cause any of the varieties of trouble that Mrs. Briggs was accustomed to managing. He paid his week's board on time and in full. Mrs. Briggs, who had a nose for people's financial situations that was nearly supernatural in its accuracy, declared him a decent prospect. She said this to Edna while they were folding sheets, which was how Mrs. Briggs often delivered assessments that she wanted to seem casual. "That Bailey man," she said, "he's got some savings put by. You can tell by the way he spends." "I wouldn't know about that," Edna said. "No, you wouldn't," Mrs. Briggs said, with the particular inflection she used when she was simultaneously agreeing with something and finding it vaguely pitiful. What Edna did know was that Clyde Bailey had begun stopping to speak with her when their paths crossed, in the way that could not be attributed to coincidence after the 3rd or 4th time, but that was still gentle enough in its approach that it did not feel like pressure. He asked her about the town, about the people in it, about the land on the eastern side of the ridge that he had ridden out to look at twice now. She answered him with the knowledge she had accumulated from 8 years of listening to boarders talk, which was more considerable than most people would have assumed. "You know a lot about this place," he said one evening, when they had somehow ended up both sitting on the front steps of the boarding house in the cooling air of a September evening, which was not a thing she had planned and which she suspected he had not planned either, though she was less certain of that. "I've been here a long time," she said. "Do you like it here?" The question was so direct that it took her a moment to formulate an honest answer rather than a reflexive one. The reflexive answer would have been something mild and noncommittal, a habit she had developed as protective coloring. But there was something in the way he asked it that made the reflexive answer feel wrong, like wearing the wrong size shoe. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've never really thought about whether I like it. It's where I am." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I spent 9 years driving cattle, Cheyenne to Abilene and back and variations thereof. 9 years of being in motion and never being anywhere in particular." He paused. "I got tired of it." "What do you want instead?" she asked. He looked out at the street where the last light of the day was turning the dusk gold. "Something that's mine," he said. "Something I built, something quiet." He was quiet himself for a moment. "Is that small sounding to you?" "No," she said, and she said it with more certainty than she had expected to feel. "No, it doesn't sound small at all." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and something passed between them that was too early to name and too real to dismiss. And then a board creaked inside the house, and they both shifted slightly, and the moment loosened itself without disappearing entirely. That night, in her narrow room in the back of the boarding house, Edna lay awake and thought about what it would mean to want something. Not in the practical sense of wanting her situation to improve, which was a thing she had always wanted in the abstract, the way a person wants better weather, but in the specific sense of wanting a particular thing. She was 24 years old and she had been wanted by men before, in ways that had taught her to be careful rather than hopeful. And she had not made the error of confusing being wanted with being cared about since she was about 18, when a ranch hand named Travis something or other had said a great many things and meant very few of them. But this felt different in a way that made her cautious precisely because it felt different. She was aware of the gap between how things felt and what they were, and she was not a woman who liked to be surprised by that gap. She told herself to be careful. She was going to be careful. She was not particularly successful at being careful. The eastern parcel of land that Clyde had been looking at belonged to a widow named Mrs. Clara Fenn, who was the mother of Walter Fenn, the traveling merchant, and who had more land than she could manage after her husband died 2 years prior. The parcel was 40 acres of decent range land, with a creek running along its eastern boundary, and a stand of cottonwood trees that made it look less harsh than the surrounding territory. There was no structure on it beyond the remains of a fence line that had been let go, but the soil was workable and the water access was good, and the price that Mrs. Fenn was asking was, according to anyone Clyde had managed to consult, reasonable. He told Edna about it on a Saturday afternoon when she was taking her one free hour of the week, which she spent sitting on a bench outside Pearl's shop when the weather allowed, because Pearl closed on Saturday afternoons and left a key so Edna could sit in the shade of the awning without having to justify her presence to anyone. She had a cup of coffee from the small pot she had poured before leaving and a 2-week-old newspaper she had already read, and she was content in the particular quiet way of a person who has very few hours to themselves and knows how to use them. Clyde appeared at the end of the street and walked toward her with the unhurried quality that she had by now identified as genuinely characteristic of him rather than effect, and he sat down on the bench beside her with enough space between them to be decent and enough closeness to be intentional and said, "I think I'm going to buy it." "The Fenn parcel," she said, because the whole town had been following his land search with interest. 40 acres, he said. "It's enough to start with. I'll run a few cattle, put in a kitchen garden, see what the land will do." He paused. "I know how to build. I spent 2 winters in Abilene working for a man who did construction, and I learned enough that I can put up a sound structure." "A house?" she asked. "A cabin first," he said. "Small, practical. You don't need much space if the space you have is your own." He said this last part with a quiet conviction that she recognized, because it was the same conviction she felt about her narrow back room at the boarding house, which was hers in the limited sense that no one else slept in it, and which she valued for exactly that limited reason. "That sounds like a good plan," she said. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was careful and direct at the same time, which she was coming to recognize as simply the way he looked when he was about to say something he had thought about beforehand. "I'd like it to be more than a good plan," he said. "I'd like it to be a good life. Eventually." Edna was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through the gap between the buildings across the street and lit the dust in the air, and somewhere down the block someone was playing a fiddle badly and stopping and starting again. "What does that mean?" she asked. She asked it plainly because she had decided in the night that if he was going to be the kind of man she thought he might be, she could be the kind of woman she actually was rather than the careful, deflecting version she had constructed for safety. "It means I would like very much to know you better," he said. "If you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment. "I've been disappointed before," she said. "I say that not to be discouraging, but because I think you should know that I am not someone who takes things lightly, and I don't expect other people to." "That's fair," he said. He did not rush to reassure her or diminish what she had said or turn it into a thing about himself. He simply accepted it as information and sat with it. "All right," she said. "Then yes, I'm willing." The fiddle down the block finally found its note and held it, long and sweet in the cooling afternoon, and Edna drank her coffee and felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, something tentative and hopeful and terrifying in the best possible way. October came to Colton Creek with crisp air and skies so blue they looked painted, and Clyde Bailey bought the 40 acres from Clara Fenn with the money he had saved over 9 years of cattle driving, a sum that had required more discipline than most men managed to maintain on the trail. And he registered the deed with the county, and rode out to his land on the first morning it was his, and stood there for what Pearl later reported, via second-hand sources, was a very long time. He started building on the second day. The cabin he was planning was not elaborate. He had thought it through in the careful way he thought through everything, and he had determined that a single-room structure of about 400 square feet, with a stone fireplace, a proper plank floor, and a covered porch facing east, was achievable before the hard cold came if he worked steadily. He had a plan drawn on a piece of paper that he had folded and unfolded so many times it was beginning to wear at the creases, and he had purchased the lumber he needed from the mill over in Harker City, 12 miles east, and had arranged for it to be delivered in 2 loads. He did not ask for help, but Colton Creek being the kind of place it was, help was offered before he had a chance to establish that he didn't need it. Old George Mercer, who had a ranch 2 miles north and had known Clara Fenn's late husband, appeared on the third morning with 2 of his ranch hands and a very matter-of-fact attitude about the whole thing. "You're going to need more hands to get the frame up," George said, as though this was information rather than an offer. And it was an offer, and Clyde accepted it in the same spirit it was given, and the frame went up that day. Pearl told Edna about all of this in considerable detail, and Edna listened while hemming a pillowcase and did not ask any of the questions she actually wanted to ask, which Pearl knew perfectly well and found enormously entertaining. On the Sunday after the frame went up, Clyde came to find Edna after church service, which was a public enough location that Mrs. Briggs could not reasonably object, though she stood in the churchyard and watched with the expression of someone who was gathering evidence. He asked if she would like to come out to the land and see what he had started, and she said yes, and he helped her up onto his horse, and she rode behind him with her hands light on his sides, feeling the sun warm on her back and the ground moving beneath them. The 40 acres were beautiful in the October light. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold, and the grass was dry and pale and whispered against the horse's legs, and the frame of the cabin stood in the middle of the parcel, with the particular bare honesty of a thing that is in the process of becoming itself. She could see what it would be, and she could see that it would be exactly what he had described, small and practical and solid. She stood in the open frame and looked at the four walls that weren't yet walls, and the sky above that would eventually be a roof, and she felt something she did not have a word for immediately, something in the vicinity of possibility. "It's going to be good," she said. He was standing beside her, looking at the same framed-in space, and he said, "I think so too." They stood there in the October light, not quite touching, with the cottonwoods rustling behind them and the hawk circling high overhead, and it was one of the best moments Edna had experienced in longer than she could conveniently calculate. November moved in like a careful guest, bringing cold nights and frost by morning, and the cabin came together with a steadiness that matched the man building it. Edna went out to see it twice more, once with Pearl as company because she was not yet willing to go entirely alone without acknowledging why, and once by herself, because she decided that willing something and doing something were two different things, and she had spent enough of her life willing things. That second visit alone was on a Tuesday when Mrs. Briggs had gone to her sister's place in Harker City for the day, and Edna's duties were lighter than usual, and she arranged to have them done by midday. She borrowed Pearl's brown mare and rode out in the early afternoon, and when she arrived, Clyde was on the roof laying shingles, moving with the focused efficiency of someone who has a deadline in mind and the skill to meet it. He came down when he saw her, and they walked around the outside of the cabin together, and she saw that the walls were up and the roof was mostly done, and there was a door frame but no door yet, and the stone for the fireplace had been gathered and stacked beside the east wall waiting to be laid. The front porch posts were up, but the planking hadn't been laid yet. "It's further along than I expected," she said. "I have some motivation to finish before the serious cold," he said, and then he looked at her with that direct, measured quality that she had learned to recognize as him saying something that mattered, and other motivation besides. She looked at the cabin. She looked at him. She said, "Clyde, what are you thinking about when you think about this? About what it's for, I mean. What you want it to be?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that she had learned was not evasion but thought. Then he said, "I'm thinking about a quiet life. I know that's not what most people want to hear when they're young. Most people want to hear about adventure or fortune or something big. But I've had 9 years of moving, and I know what I want now, and what I want is this." He gestured at the cabin, the land, the cottonwoods, "a place of my own, a decent life, someone to share it with who actually wants to be there." Edna looked at him steadily. "And who is it you're imagining sharing it with?" "I think you know," he said, "but I'll say it plainly if you want me to." "I do want you to," she said. "I've had things left unsaid that I was meant to infer, and I don't like it. I prefer plain." He smiled at that, a real smile that changed his whole face and that she realized she had been waiting for without knowing it. "I'm hoping it's you, Edna. I'd like very much for it to be you if you're willing. And I know that's a significant thing to say after 2 months, and I'm not asking you to decide anything today." She was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light lay golden across the land, and the cottonwoods along the creek whispered, and a pair of quail moved through the dry grass 20 feet away. "My whole life," she said slowly, "I have been somewhere that wasn't mine. Working for someone else in a building that was someone else's, eating what was left over, sleeping in a room I could be turned out of. I have never had anything that was really mine." She paused. "I want this. I think I do want this. I just want you to know that when I make a decision about something like this, I mean it. I don't take it back and I don't do it halfway." "I know that," he said. "I've seen it in you from the beginning." "And you want that?" she asked, because she had learned to ask, because she had discovered that some men claimed to want a woman who meant what she said right up until she actually meant something. "I want exactly that," he said. She looked at the cabin frame and the stacked fireplace stones and the golden cottonwoods, and she thought about being nowhere in particular for 24 years, and she thought about this man who had thought carefully about what he wanted and then gone and started building it, and she said, "Then keep building, and I'll keep thinking." He nodded. He understood, and he did not push, and that was perhaps the thing that mattered most. She rode back to Colton Creek in the late afternoon light, feeling like something inside her had been rearranged into a shape that fit better, and she could not decide if that was terrifying or wonderful, and eventually decided it was both. Pearl, when told of this conversation in heavily edited form, declared it the most romantic thing she had heard in 3 years and threatened to embroider it on something, which Edna told her firmly she was not to do. December arrived and the cabin was finished. Not decorated or furnished in any meaningful way, but structurally finished, with a solid roof and a plank floor and a working fireplace and a proper door with an iron latch and 2 windows with shutters, and the covered front porch with its eastern view of the cottonwoods and the creek. It was small, as promised. 1 room and a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder, a kitchen area along one wall. The fireplace taking up most of the north wall, built with flat gray creek stones by Clyde and George Mercer's taciturn eldest son over the course of 3 days. When Clyde took Edna to see the finished cabin, the first snow of the season was coming down in fat, lazy flakes that were melting when they hit the ground, and the light was soft and gray, and the cabin sat in the middle of the 40 acres looking exactly like what it was, which was something built with intention and care by someone who meant to stay. Edna stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the small interior with its bare walls and empty floor, and she thought about what Pearl had said once, which was that a room without furniture was just a possibility. She stepped inside. The fireplace was lit, because Clyde had ridden out ahead of her to start it, and the warmth came from the stones slowly and steadily, and filled the small space without any drama. She stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly and looked at the walls and the windows and the ceiling, and she felt something happen in her chest that she decided, definitively, was love. She turned to find Clyde watching her from the doorway, leaning against the frame with the snow coming down quietly behind him, and she said, "You promised me a small cabin and a quiet life." He stood up straight. "I did," he said carefully. "I want you to know," she said, "that no one has ever promised me either of those things before. No one has ever offered me anything so solid." She paused. "That might sound small to some people." "It doesn't sound small to me," he said. "It isn't small," she said firmly. "It's more than I have ever been offered, and I'm saying yes." He crossed the room in 3 strides and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with everything showing in his face. No careful distance or measured expression, just the truth of what he felt, and she looked back at him with everything showing in hers, and then he said, "Edna Rhodes, will you marry me?" And she said, "Yes, Clyde Bailey, I will." He pressed her hands between both of his, and she felt the warmth of them and the steadiness of them. And outside the snow came down quietly on the 40 acres, on the cottonwoods and the creek and the new-built cabin. And it was so simply and completely the right moment that Edna, who did not cry easily, found her eyes stinging in a way she decided to attribute to the smoke from the fireplace. They were married on the 2nd Saturday of January in 1879, in the little white church on Main Street, with Pastor William Dorsey officiating in his careful, dignified way that suited the occasion. Edna wore the best dress Pearl had been quietly making for 3 weeks, a deep blue wool that Pearl had sourced from a bolt she had been saving, and it fit Edna as exactly as a dress could fit, because Pearl had been watching Edna's measurements for years, with the professional appreciation of a woman whose livelihood depended on cloth and form. Clyde wore his good coat, and a shirt that was clearly new and had been pressed by someone who knew what they were doing. George Mercer sat in the front pew on the groom's side as the nearest thing to family Clyde had in the county, and Pearl sat on the bride's side and cried loudly enough that Edna could hear her distinctly during the quieter portions of the vows, which she would have found distracting if she hadn't been too focused on Clyde's face to be distracted by anything. The vows were traditional, the words worn smooth by centuries of use, but Clyde said them in a way that made each word feel specific and deliberate, as though he had thought carefully about each one before committing to it. Which, knowing him, he had. Edna said hers clearly and without hesitation, because she had decided, and she meant it, and that was all there was to it. When Pastor Dorsey said man and wife, and Clyde kissed her, brief and warm and real, Pearl made a sound that caused half the congregation to smile, and Edna felt as though the whole small church had expanded somehow, or perhaps she had, into a shape that finally matched the space she was standing in. The reception was held in the church hall, organized by Mrs. Mercer and Pearl, and several of the town's women who had opinions about proper celebrating, and implemented those opinions with efficiency. There was food from every household represented, and George Mercer had a fiddle player come down from his ranch, who was considerably better than the one Edna had heard practicing on Main Street in September, and people danced on the plank floor, while the January wind pressed against the windows, and the inside was warm and loud and alive with all the generous ordinary human warmth of a community gathering itself around two people beginning something together. Edna danced with her husband twice, which was all the dancing she had ever learned, and the second time she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder and felt his arm tighten around her, and thought that 8 years of keeping her head down and her mouth shut had not prepared her for any of this, and that she was deeply, profoundly glad. They moved into the cabin the following morning, with the few things Edna had accumulated over 8 years in the boarding house, which fit into her trunk and a carpet bag, and one wooden crate that Clyde carried under one arm. He had furnished the cabin in the week since she'd said yes, not extravagantly but thoughtfully, a proper bedstead for the loft, a kitchen table and 2 chairs, a rocker near the fireplace, shelves for the kitchen things, a chest for linens. He had made the table and the shelves himself, and they were not ornate but they were solid and square and fit the space. When everything was arranged, Edna stood in the middle of the cabin and looked around at their combined small inventory of worldly goods, and felt the particular and profound satisfaction of someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey. She went to the window and looked out at the land, pale and frost-covered in the January light, and she said, "I am going to be very happy here." Clyde came to stand beside her. "I'm going to make sure of it," he said. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she said, and she said it the way she said things now, without the hard edge she had developed for protection, just honestly. "I'll only make the ones I can," he said. She believed him. She had believed him for a while now. The first winter in the cabin was cold and occasionally difficult in the way that frontier winters always were, with the wind finding the gaps that Clyde had not yet had a chance to chink properly, and the snow coming in quantities that kept them close to the fire for days at a time, and the wood supply requiring careful management. But it was their cold and their difficulty, negotiated between them in the close quarters of the small cabin, and it generated more warmth than inconvenience. She learned him in that winter the way you learn a person when there is nowhere to put distance between you, and what she learned confirmed everything she had tentatively believed in the fall. He was steady and patient and funny in a dry, quiet way that surprised her regularly. He had strong opinions about a small number of things, and no opinions at all about a large number of things, which was a comfortable distribution. He woke before dawn without complaint and worked until dark without theater. He listened when she talked, actually listened in the way that required him to respond with something connected to what she had said rather than something that had been waiting to be said regardless. He asked her opinion on things that mattered, and on some things that didn't, apparently because he actually wanted to know. And he was tender with her in a way she had not expected, and which undid her regularly in small, private ways that she did not try to explain or diminish. It was in the way he brought her coffee in the morning before she asked for it, and in the way he looked at her across the room sometimes with a quality of attention that felt like being held without any physical contact, and in the way he said her name, Edna, with something in it that was specific to her, and not to anyone else. She was so thoroughly in love with him by February that it felt like a physical thing, like warmth, like the particular quality of light on a cold morning. He was, apparently, similarly situated. He told her so in a way that was characteristically direct and unhurried, one evening when they were sitting by the fire with the wind outside, and he said, "I want you to know that I am very much in love with you, in case that wasn't apparent." It was somewhat apparent, she said. "Good," he said. "I just wanted to be plain." She put her hand over his. "I love you too, Clyde, very much." The fire crackled and the wind went on outside, and inside the small cabin it was exactly warm enough. Spring came, and with it, the work of the land. Clyde had purchased a small herd of cattle through the winter, 12 head to start, sourcing them carefully from ranches he had researched and negotiated with patiently. And in the spring, the 40 acres came alive with the particular organized activity of a working farm coming into itself. He fenced the eastern pasture and began work on a proper barn, smaller than the cabin but solid, and Edna planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the cabin in the patch of ground that received the most direct sun. She had never gardened before in any serious way, but she had paid attention over years of cooking, and she knew what she needed, and she grew it. The barn went up in April with the help of George Mercer's crew again, and it was a good day, the kind of day that the West could produce in spring when everything conspired to be beautiful, the sky enormous and clear, the land green from the winter moisture, everyone in good spirits and working well. Edna cooked for the work crew, a substantial undertaking that she planned for 3 days ahead of time and executed without difficulty. And when the day was done and the barn was standing and the men had gone home, Clyde found her on the front porch in the last light and kissed her in the thoroughgoing way he had of kissing her when he was feeling something strongly, and told her it had been the best day he could remember in a long time. "Better than the day you finished the cabin?" she asked. "Different," he said. "That was a good day. This was a good day with you in it." She pulled him back down by the collar and kissed him again. They had a neighbor, beside the Mercer operation to the north, in the form of a family named Carver who had settled a parcel on the western side of their land the previous winter. The Carvers were a husband and wife, Tom and Josie, both in their early 30s, with 2 small children and a third on the way, and they had come from Tennessee with a fierce practical competence that Edna respected, and a friendliness that she and Clyde both welcomed. Josie Carver was a woman who said exactly what she thought, and did it with such complete absence of malice that it never landed badly, and Edna liked her immediately. Josie came over one May morning with her 2 children in tow and a jar of preserved peaches that she said she had more of than she needed. And within 20 minutes she and Edna were in the kitchen discussing the relative merits of different approaches to bread making, with the intensity of 2 people who have finally found someone worth talking to. And the children were running in the yard outside. And Clyde was visible through the window mending fence and occasionally glancing toward the house with an expression that Josie caught and commented on with minimal subtlety. "That man looks at you like the sun rises out of your particular direction," Josie said. Edna looked out the window. Clyde had indeed glanced toward the house again. "He does," she said, and she let herself feel what that meant without qualifying it. "You two are a fortunate pair," Josie said, without any envy in it, just the simple observation of someone who recognized something good when she saw it. "We are," Edna said. "I know it." The summer of 1879 was hot and dry, and put a strain on the water situation that Clyde managed with the creativity of someone who had spent years problem-solving in circumstances that did not allow for waiting for someone else to solve the problem. He extended a catch from the creek to a storage tank he built himself, and he negotiated with Tom Carver about shared water management for the stretch of creek that ran along the boundary between their parcels, and together they worked out an arrangement that served both households. It was the beginning of a practical friendship between the 2 men that Edna found she was glad of, because Clyde was not by nature a man who sought out company, and having one genuine friend in geographic proximity seemed to suit him without overwhelming him. The cattle were doing well. He had added another 8 head through the summer, buying carefully, and the herd was healthy and the 40 acres was producing enough grass to sustain them. He was not getting rich, but he was not supposed to be getting rich. He was supposed to be building something that would last, and it was lasting. In August, Edna told him she thought she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before he went out to work, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, because she had found that mornings were the best time for significant conversations with Clyde, when he was alert and present, and before the day had accumulated any of its various demands. He was very still for a moment, and then his face did a thing she had only seen it do twice before, on their wedding day, and on the day they had first talked in the open frame of the cabin, which was the thing of all the careful steadiness coming down to reveal what was underneath it, which was something very tender and very real. "Are you sure?" he said. "Reasonably sure," she said. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his and said, "How do you feel about it?" She had thought about how she felt about it for 3 days before telling him. She felt about it the way she felt about everything that mattered, which was with an intensity that she had learned to examine before acting on. "I feel like I want it," she said. "Very much. I want our child to grow up here, on this land in this cabin with us." He pressed her hands to his mouth and closed his eyes, and she felt his exhale against her knuckles, and thought there had never been a moment in her life that was more quietly perfect than this one. "I'm going to put in another room," he said when he had collected himself. "The cabin is fine," she said. "It's fine for 2, he said. "We're going to need more room. I'll put on an addition before spring." She smiled at him. "Always building. Always having reason to," he said. Pearl was informed that afternoon and reacted with a volume and enthusiasm that carried clearly from Pearl's doorway to the opposite side of the street, and Mrs. Briggs, who happened to be crossing at that moment, heard it and looked over and looked at Edna and did something that might, in the right light, have been a smile, before resuming her brisk and upright progress down the street. The baby was due in the late spring, and Clyde built the addition through the fall with the focused energy of a man who has a deadline he considers important. Tom Carver helped him, and George Mercer's eldest son came over twice, and by the time the November cold settled in properly, there was a proper second room off the north side of the cabin, with a window that caught the morning light and enough space for a proper cradle and a small chest, and whatever else a child might need. Edna lined the cradle with fabric Pearl donated and sewed curtains for the window and put a small braided rug on the floor. And when it was all arranged, she stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at it and felt a fullness in her chest that was one of the most complete feelings she had ever had. The winter was harder than the previous one. There was a stretch in February when the temperature dropped to levels that made going outside a genuine hardship, and the cattle needed constant attention in ways that kept Clyde outdoors in cold that Edna watched him come back from with frost in his beard, and a steadiness that she sometimes found both admirable and worrying. She kept the fire going and kept hot food ready, and kept herself occupied with the sewing and the preserves and the reading she had taken up seriously since moving to the cabin, because the boarding house had not afforded much time for reading, and she had discovered she loved it. They read to each other in the evenings, which had started as something she did on a whim, and had become a nightly ritual that she considered one of the small perfect things of her life. They worked through everything they could borrow from the small collection at the church and from Pearl, who accumulated books the way some people accumulated weather, casually and in quantity, and the evenings by the fire with Clyde's voice reading and the wind outside and the warmth inside were evenings Edna kept in the front of her mind as the definition of what she had wanted when she had first allowed herself to want anything. On the 5th of April, 1880, after a labor attended by Josie Carver and a midwife named Agnes Hollies who came from Harker City, Edna and Clyde's son was born into the small room off the north side of the cabin in the early morning light, while outside the first real warmth of spring was arriving. He was a healthy, loud boy with dark hair like his mother and the same particular gray-blue eyes as his father, which Edna noticed immediately and found she could not stop looking at. They named him Samuel James Bailey, the James being for Clyde's father, who had been a decent man and was long gone. Clyde held his son for the first time with the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered, and he looked at the small face and the small hands and the tremendous reality of Samuel James Bailey, who was 7 hours old and already expressing opinions about the world, and his face did the thing again, the careful steadiness coming down to show what was underneath it. "Hello, Samuel," he said, very quietly. Samuel expressed an opinion. Edna watched them from the bed and felt something so large and complete that she had no frame for it, only the experience of it, which was sufficiently vast. She had told Clyde once that no one had ever offered her a small cabin and a quiet life, and that it was more than she had ever been offered. She thought about that now, watching her husband hold their son in the morning light of the room he had built for exactly this purpose, and she understood that the cabin and the life were just the visible shape of what she had actually been offered, which was something much larger than either of those things. She had been offered to be known and wanted by a man who meant what he said. She had been offered a place that was genuinely hers. She had been offered the extraordinary, ordinary experience of being home. Samuel was a robust and curious child from his earliest days, which created new organizational challenges in the cabin that Edna managed with the same systematic efficiency she had brought to the boarding house, only now in service of a life she had chosen rather than a life she had fallen into. Clyde was a father with the same quality he brought to everything, steady and present and patient, and his son seemed to understand this in the way that small children understood things, primarily through the body, by the quality of being held, and Samuel was a child who never seemed uncertain of whether he was wanted. The herd had grown to 32 head by the summer of 1880, and Clyde had hired a hand, a young man named Eli Price, who was 17 and serious, and had ridden in from somewhere east looking for work and found it. Eli lived in a small bunkroom Clyde had built off the barn, and he worked with a diligence that earned him a wage that was fair and a permanent situation that he seemed both surprised by and relieved to have. Edna fed him at the family table, which he was initially awkward about in the way of someone not accustomed to being treated as a person rather than a function, and which he eventually relaxed into with a gratitude that was never spoken but was entirely apparent. The town of Colton Creek had grown through these 2 years as well, the way small western towns were growing in this period, with new faces arriving with the regularity that characterized a territory still being settled. A doctor had set up a practice in a converted building on the east end of Main Street, which was an improvement over the prior situation, which had been Agnes Holly's and a great deal of improvisation. A small school had been established by a woman named Miss Ruth Galway, who was 22 and from the East, and had come west with a teacher's certificate, and a determination that struck everyone who met her as both admirable and slightly alarming in its intensity. Pearl had expanded her seamstress shop to include a small millinery section, and had hired a young assistant, and she remained Edna's closest friend, coming out to the cabin with some regularity and filling the rooms with the particular energy she generated wherever she went, which Samuel found absolutely riveting from the moment he was old enough to focus his eyes on anything. "He is the best-looking child in the county," Pearl said, holding Samuel on a Sunday visit in the summer of 1880, when he was a few months past 3 and had opinions about everything. "I'm not saying that just to be agreeable." "You rarely say things just to be agreeable," Edna said. "True," Pearl said. "I'm saying it because it's accurate." She looked at Samuel with a delight that was entirely genuine. "What's he saying?" "He's saying he wants to go see the horses," Clyde said from the doorway, where he had appeared with his hat in his hand and the easy quality he always carried on Sundays, which were the one day he held to being unhurried even when there was work undone. "Shall we all go see the horses?" Pearl said to Samuel. Samuel expressed strong support for this plan. They all went to see the horses, and it was a fine afternoon, warm and golden in the way of late summer, and they stood at the fence of the small corral, and the horses came over with the curiosity of animals who had been well treated, and Pearl held Samuel up so he could see better, and Clyde stood beside Edna and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side in the way she had come to do without thinking about it, the way you lean against something you know is solid. And she watched her son reach out his small hand toward the nearest horse, and felt the afternoon hold all of them in it like a warm hand. Later, after Pearl had gone and Eli had taken himself off somewhere and Samuel had been put to bed with the particular exhaustion of a small child who has had a very satisfactory day, Edna and Clyde sat on the front porch in the cooling evening, and she said, "Clyde, are you happy?" He looked at her. "You know I am." "I know," she said. "I just like to hear it." "I'm happy," he said. "I'm so happy it sometimes feels strange to me because I didn't know it was going to feel like this." "What did you think it was going to feel like?" He thought about it. "I thought it was going to feel like having something," he said. "I thought it was going to feel like possession, like owning a thing." He paused. "It doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like being somewhere, like arriving." She looked out at the land, dark and quiet under the stars, the cottonwoods invisible but present, the creek making its small sound in the distance. "I know exactly what you mean," she said. He took her hand and held it. The stars came all the way down to the horizon, more stars than you could see anywhere near a town, and the September air was just beginning to carry the first suggestion of the cold that would come later, and the 32 cattle were settled in the pasture, and the horses were quiet in the corral, and Samuel was asleep in his room, and it was so exactly everything she had ever wanted that she held it carefully, the way you hold something precious, aware of its weight. In the autumn of 1880, a small thing happened that was nevertheless significant in the way that small things in tight communities can be. The boarding house changed hands. Mrs. Briggs, who had been in gradually worsening health for a year, sold the property to a couple from Austin named the Hendersons, and retired to live with her daughter in San Antonio, and the boarding house became a somewhat warmer and more hospitable establishment almost immediately. Edna heard about this from Pearl on one of Pearl's Sunday visits, and she felt something that took her a moment to identify as relief. She had not realized until that moment that she had been carrying a low-level tension about Mrs. Briggs's continued proximity, the way you carry tension about something that once had power over you and might theoretically again. The tension, identified, dissolved. She was 26 years old and a wife and a mother and a landholder, and Mrs. Briggs no longer had any power over anything in her life and hadn't for almost 2 years. "Does that make you sad?" Pearl asked, watching her. "No," Edna said. "It makes me feel settled." In the spring of 1881, Edna told Clyde she thought she was expecting again. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning again because it had worked well the first time. He was quiet for a moment, and then the steadiness came down and everything underneath it showed, and he said, "How do you feel?" "Glad," she said. "Genuinely glad." "Me too," he said, and the way he said it meant everything. This time it was somewhat easier than the first, or perhaps she simply knew better what to expect, and the second child arrived in the November of 1881. A girl this time, brown-haired like her mother, and already demonstrating at 12 hours old a quality of attention that suggested she was going to be a person with opinions. They named her Clara, after Clara Fenn, who had sold them the land, and after Clyde's grandmother, whose name it also happened to be, which seemed sufficient reason. Samuel, who was now a year and a half and had walked early and talked early, and seemed to consider the world a comprehensively interesting place, regarded his sister with a mixture of fascination and suspicion that Edna recognized as entirely appropriate for his situation. Within 2 weeks the suspicion had faded, and the fascination had won, and Samuel was regularly found sitting beside Clara's cradle making faces that he seemed to believe were communicating something important. The cabin, with the addition Clyde had built, was exactly large enough for the four of them, with the particular organized intimacy of a family that knew how to share space. Edna had made it as much her own as any place she had ever been, which meant more than the physical arrangement. The kitchen shelves held her things. The garden outside was her planting. The braided rugs were her work. The embroidered panel above the fireplace was Pearl's gift, but Edna's choice to hang it there. It was hers in every way that mattered, and she felt that ownership not as possession but as belonging, which was the only kind of ownership she had ever wanted. Through 1882 and into 1883, the Bailey Ranch, as it had come to be known informally, grew in the steady way that things grow when they are built on a sound foundation and attended to with consistent care. The herd reached 50 head, which was a number Clyde had identified as sustainable on the 40 acres with responsible grazing management, and he kept to it with the principled practicality he brought to everything. Eli Price, who was 20 now, had grown into a fully capable hand and a young man of quiet good character, and Clyde paid him well and treated him accordingly. Tom and Josie Carver to the west had expanded their own operation and had their third child, a boy, which gave Samuel a playmate of approximately the right age, and the two families had become the kind of neighbors who were also genuinely friends, which in that country was not to be taken for granted. The town continued to grow. A telegraph line was run through Colton Creek in 1882, connecting it to Harker City and from there to the wider world, and a second general store opened, and Miss Galway's school expanded into a proper schoolhouse with 2 rooms. A photograph studio arrived, operated by a man named Mr. Felix Vane, who had a very large mustache and an absolute conviction in the importance of his work, and Pearl organized an expedition to have photographs made of Edna and Clyde and the children in the spring of 1883, which required considerable negotiation with Samuel about holding still. The resulting photograph sat on the shelf in the cabin, and Edna looked at it sometimes when she was cooking or sewing and the children were elsewhere, and she saw herself in it, tall and steady, standing beside her husband with her daughter on her hip and her son held by Clyde at her other side, and she looked at the face in the photograph, which was her face, and saw that it was the face of someone who had arrived somewhere. She had not always looked like that. She knew it. There was a photograph of her at the boarding house, taken by a traveling photographer the summer she was 22, and in that one she wore an expression that she recognized now as the expression of someone who has learned to take up very little space, someone who keeps their head down and their mouth shut and hopes the world will leave them be. The woman in the new photograph was not taking up very little space. She was taking up exactly the right amount of space, which was hers, which she had earned, which she was not giving back. One autumn evening in 1883, when the children were in bed and the fire was going and the harvest was in and the cattle were settled, Edna and Clyde sat together on the front porch as they so often did, in the rocking chairs he had made in the spring, and the night was clear and the stars were out and the creek made its sound in the distance. "I've been thinking," Clyde said. "About what?" "About the land." He was quiet for a moment. "There's an adjacent parcel. 20 acres on the northern boundary between us and the Mercer operation. George has been trying to manage it himself, but he told me last week he's thinking of selling." "And you want to buy it?" she asked. "I want to ask what you think about it," he said. "It's our decision." She thought about it. 20 additional acres would mean more work to manage, but it would also mean more water access from the creek's northern fork, which had been a limitation in dry years. It would mean room to expand if they wanted to, or room to simply have, which was its own kind of security. "What's the price?" he told her. "Can we manage it?" she asked. "If we're careful through the winter." She was quiet for a moment. "Then yes," she said, "I think we should," he smiled. "All right, Clyde, yes, thank you for asking me." He looked at her with an expression that was almost surprised. "Of course I asked you." "I know," she said. "I just want you to know I notice it." He took her hand across the armrest between their chairs. "I'll always ask you," he said. "This is ours." She held his hand and looked out at the dark land and the stars and felt the particular and irreplaceable rightness of it. The 20 acres were purchased in November of 1883 from George Mercer, who was glad of the sale and glad it was going to people he trusted. And Clyde registered the deed, and the Bailey Ranch became 60 acres, which sat in the fold of the two ridgelines and looked north to the Mercer land and east along the creek and south toward Colton Creek and west to the Carver operation. And it was properly, permanently, inalienably theirs. The following spring brought with it a development that Edna had been half expecting without consciously acknowledging. She was expecting it. Pearl came out to the cabin on a Sunday with news that had her sitting on her hands with the effort of containing it, which was a visible physical struggle for Pearl. And then she let it out all at once. She had been courted over the winter by a man named Oliver Marsh, who was a quiet and steady carpenter who had arrived in Colton Creek the previous fall, and she had decided to marry him. Edna set down what she was holding and crossed the kitchen and took Pearl's hands and looked at her friend's face, which was lit with a happiness so straightforward and complete that it was genuinely beautiful. "Tell me everything," Edna said. Pearl told her everything at length, with the volume and enthusiasm appropriate to the occasion, and Edna listened to every word of it, and thought about Pearl finding what she deserved to find, what they both deserved to find, and felt something that was not separate from her own happiness but was woven through it. Pearl and Oliver Marsh were married in June of 1884, a bright and warm June wedding that half the town attended with goodwill. Edna made the wedding cake, which was not her particular area of expertise, but which she executed with characteristic determination, and which turned out respectably. Pearl wore ivory satin that she had made herself, because Pearl was her own best advertisement, and Oliver Marsh stood at the altar with the expression of someone who cannot quite believe his luck, which was the appropriate expression for his circumstances. After the ceremony, Edna and Clyde danced together at the reception, and she thought about their own wedding 5 years earlier in this same church, and she pressed her cheek against his shoulder for a moment as they danced and said, "5 years." "5 years," he agreed, and his arm tightened around her. "Are you glad?" she asked. "Every single day," he said. She believed him without reservation, because 5 years of daily evidence was conclusive, and because she was glad every single day herself, and because some things, once you had them properly and completely, became simply the truth of your life rather than something you had to keep checking on. The children grew the way children do in the country, in the particular combination of freedom and work that gives them a quality of competence early. Samuel, who was 5 in the summer of 1884, was already involved in the daily work of the ranch in the ways appropriate to his size and capability, bringing water and checking fence lines, and following Clyde and Eli Price on their rounds with the serious attention of a child who considers himself a professional in training. He had his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's directness, and a disposition that combined their best qualities into something original, which is the mysterious alchemy of children. Clara, approaching 3, was a different kind of creature entirely, quieter and more observing, the kind of child who watched everything closely for a long time before committing to any action, which Edna recognized as her own quality and found she loved it more completely in her daughter than she had ever managed to love it in herself. In the evenings, Edna read to them both before bed, sitting on the edge of Samuel's bed with Clara tucked beside him, reading the books Pearl sent and the ones Miss Galway recommended from the school's small library. And she gave them stories the way she had never been given stories, with time and attention and the pleasure of the telling. Clyde appeared in the doorway of the children's room one evening while she was reading, leaning against the frame in the way he had learned to appear in doorways without interrupting. And when she looked up, he was watching her with Samuel and Clara, with an expression so nakedly full of love that she had to look back at the page for a moment to gather herself before continuing. After the children were asleep, she found him on the porch and put her arms around him from behind, her face against the back of his shoulder, and held him for a moment without speaking. "What's this for?" he said, his hands coming to cover hers. "Nothing specific," she said. "Everything." He turned inside her arms and held her back, and they stood on the porch of their cabin on their 60 acres in the warm July night with the creek sounding and the stars doing what they did. And it was, as it had been for 5 years now, and would be for all the years ahead, exactly enough. Life on the Bailey Ranch moved through the seasons with the particular rhythm of a place that knows what it is. The work was real, and the winters were hard, and the summers were hot, and nothing came without effort, and all of it was theirs, and that made every part of it different from anything Edna had experienced before, even the difficult parts, even the January nights when the cold came through the gaps, and the firewood supply required careful counting, even the dry summers when the creek ran shallow and Clyde came in at night worn down in a way she could see in his body. Even the inevitable small losses and adjustments that life in that country required. Through 1885 and 1886, the ranch continued to be what it had become, a working and living thing, healthy and steady. Eli Price met a young woman named Margaret who worked in the Henderson boarding house, and after a proper courtship he married her, and Clyde built them a proper small house off the east side of the barn, which meant the ranch had a second dwelling and a second household, and the comfortable fullness of a place where people were choosing to be. Miss Galway's school had been attended by Samuel since he turned 6, and he was, by Miss Galway's account, a serious and capable student who had a gift for numbers and a willingness to work that she attributed to his upbringing, which she said to Edna one afternoon when Edna came to collect him, with a directness that matched Edna's own and that Edna appreciated accordingly. "He works hard," Miss Galway said, "and he knows how to keep at something." "He learned that from his father," Edna said. "And from his mother," Miss Galway said, with the slight smile of someone who has observed both parties of a thing and drawn her conclusions. In the autumn of 1886, Edna discovered she was expecting for the 3rd time. She was 32, and she had not been certain she would have another child after Clara, and this one surprised her with a sweetness she had not anticipated. She told Clyde at the kitchen table in the morning, and he sat across from her with his coffee going cold and his face doing the thing, and then he reached across the table and took her hand. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. "The cabin is going to need another room," he said, and she laughed, a real full laugh that filled the kitchen, because he had said it with the same practical certainty as the first time, as though the child's needs were simply a series of construction problems to solve, which in his world they largely were. "I'll start the plans," he said. "Finish your coffee first," she said. He drank his coffee and then he started the plans. The 3rd child was born in the late spring of 1887, a boy they named Henry Thomas, which was not after anyone in particular except that they both liked the name, and it seemed to suit the child, who arrived with less drama than his predecessors and immediately began regarding the world with an expression of calm assessment that aged him considerably in appearance, though not in fact. Samuel, 7 now, received this development with the generosity of a child who has been well held and therefore has enough to give, and appointed himself his brother's supervisor with an authority that Henry, even at 4 weeks old, did not appear to contest. Clara, 5, studied Henry at close range for 2 full days before delivering her verdict, which was that he was acceptable, and then never seemed to question it again. The room Clyde had added on the west side of the cabin was finished before Henry arrived, and it was a good room, warm and light, and Edna put the cradle in the corner by the window and the braided rug she had made through the winter on the floor, and it was ready, as rooms for wanted children always should be. The years that followed were the long middle of a life built well, not without difficulty or loss or the ordinary ache of things changing, but sound at the center in a way that held through everything. The children grew, and the ranch grew, and Colton Creek grew, and the territory of Texas went on being the particular combination of brutal and beautiful that it had always been, and the Bailey family went on being what they had become, which was rooted. In the spring of 1890, Samuel was 10 and had begun to show the specific competence with animals and land that suggested he would eventually take on the ranch with the same purposeful care his father had built it. Clara was 8 and had begun to read with the consuming intensity of someone who has found the key to a very large room, and Henry was 3 and very fast, and had not yet acquired a reliable sense of caution, which kept everyone appropriately occupied. Pearl and Oliver Marsh had a daughter named Violet who was Clara's closest friend, and came to the ranch with some regularity, and Oliver Marsh had built a proper workshop, and had a reputation that extended to Harker City as a carpenter of unusual quality, and Pearl's shop had expanded twice. They were happy in the way of people who had waited a little longer than they expected for good things, and therefore knew the value of them. On a warm May evening in 1890, Edna sat on the front porch of the cabin in her rocking chair with Henry asleep in her lap, too large to be carried, and too small to be reliably trusted to make it to his bed under his own power after a full day, and Clyde sat beside her in his own rocker with a cup of coffee cooling on the porch rail. The sun was going down over the western ridge, and the sky was doing the particular thing it did in Texas at that hour, running through every shade of orange and rose and gold before settling into the deep blue of dusk. The cottonwoods along the creek were in their full spring green, and the sound of the water carried clearly in the still air. Somewhere in the pasture the cattle were quiet. Eli Price's lamp was lit in the window of his small house by the barn. Samuel and Clara were inside, Clara reading, and Samuel doing the arithmetic Miss Galway had assigned, which he was doing with the concentrated focus he brought to everything he considered important. Edna looked at all of it, the land and the light and the sleeping weight of her youngest in her lap and her husband beside her, and she thought about the woman she had been, keeping her head down and her mouth shut in the back of a boarding house, invisible in every way that mattered, offered nothing that was solid or hers, believing without quite articulating the belief that this was what her life was going to be. She thought about the day in the general store when she had spoken to a stranger about soap and land, and how something in her had recognized something in him before she had the words for it. And she thought about standing in the open frame of an unfinished cabin with the October sky above and feeling the first real grip of possibility. She had been offered a small cabin and a quiet life, and she had said yes to both. And in saying yes she had been given everything, which was not a small thing at all. A cabin was a place to be yourself in, and a quiet life was a life where you could hear your own thoughts, and both of those things had turned out to be the shape of a freedom she had never had before. "Clyde," she said. "Yes." She looked at him, at the profile she knew as well as she knew her own hands, at the man who had said what he meant and done what he said for 12 years now, for as long as she had known him. "Do you remember what you told me the first time you brought me out here? When the cabin was still a frame," he thought about it. "I told you I wanted a quiet life and someone to share it with who wanted to be there." "You did," she said. "You were very plain about it. You told me you preferred plain." "I still do," she said. He looked at her. "And is it what you wanted?" She looked at the land, the light, the sleeping child, the man beside her, the whole settled living weight of everything they had built together from the ground up. "It's more than I knew how to want," she said. "It's more than I thought I was allowed to want." "You were always allowed," he said. "You just needed someone to say so." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "Well, I'm saying it to myself now." He smiled at her, the real smile that she had first seen at Pearl's old shop in the Saturday afternoon of September in 1878, the smile that changed his whole face, and he reached over and took her free hand where it rested on the arm of the rocker, and held it with the particular steadiness of a man who intended to keep holding it, and she held his back with the same intention, which was the most accurate description she had ever found for what they were to each other. Henry shifted in her lap and made a small sound and settled again, and the last light went off the ridge and the first stars appeared, and the creek went on making its sound in the cottonwoods, and the lamp burned in Eli Price's window. And inside the cabin, Clara turned a page and Samuel figured out the last sum and said something quietly satisfied to himself. And it was all of a piece, all one thing, all completely theirs. She had been offered a small cabin and a quiet life, and she had said that was more than she had ever been offered, and she had been right, and she had been wrong because it had turned out to be much more than that, much more than a cabin or a quiet, much more than a promise made and kept, though it was all of those things too. It had turned out to be herself, fully, finally, in a place that was hers, with a man who had meant every word he had said and would go on meaning every word he had yet to say, and children who were the proof of everything they had chosen, and a life that was quiet in the best possible sense of the word, which was not silent or small or invisible but peaceful, genuinely peaceful, the way a thing is peaceful when it is exactly where it is supposed to be. The stars came all the way down to the horizon, and the night settled over the 60 acres of the Bailey Ranch like a warm hand, and in the rocking chairs on the front porch of the small, solid cabin, Edna and Clyde Bailey held onto each other in the dark and said nothing at all, because everything that needed to be said had been said, long ago, in the plain and direct and real way they had always spoken to each other, and it had been enough, and it still was, and it always would be.